it happened. It was the crash a year ago, January, of an Amtrak train and a Conrail locomotive that left 16 people dead. A compelling story under any circumstances. But the role played by marijuana and alcohol makes it a matter of ongoing concern.
Yes, because at the time, a great fuss was made about testing and monitoring railroad employees. But among those workers, drug and alcohol abuse continues, seemingly unabated. Since the January '87 crash, drugs and alcohol have been factors in an additional 48 accidents, in which 30 more people have died. Tom Gerald takes us back to that winter afternoon.
This is the story of an accident that didn't need to happen, a tragedy that has its roots in human frailty and governmental failure. It begins on Amtrak train number 94, the Colonial. The date was January 4th, 1987, a Sunday. The holiday season was drawing to a close. The train left Washington at 12:35 in the afternoon. It was just a few minutes behind schedule. As it pulled out of Union Station, just a few blocks from the nation's capital, the Colonial picked up speed for its run up the Northeast Corridor, headed to Baltimore, Philadelphia, New York, and its final destination, Boston. There were 579 people on board. The passengers headed back home or to work. Many of them students returning to school after Christmas and New Year's. For many, there was a sense of expectation.
I was going up to visit my parents who meet in New York and celebrate their 45th wedding anniversary.
Father Brian McCarthy, a chaplain at American University, was riding in the third car of the train. So it seemed like today we're on the Colonial, routine?
Oh yeah, I was late for that train and I was late earlier today, so I was late, beautiful day, everything.
But up ahead, there was hidden danger. 3 Conrail freight locomotives were also heading north on this parallel track. They were moving at 60 miles an hour toward a switch point connecting the 2 northbound tracks. The Colonial was doing about 120 miles an hour, slightly over its speed limit, as it approached the Gunpowder River switch about 20 miles north of Baltimore. Engineer Jerry Evans was making up for lost time, and he had every reason to believe that he had a clear track in front of him. But suddenly he saw the Conrail locomotives looming just in front of him on his track. He had only seconds to act, but it was too late.
At first, it was just a complete silence. The outside of the cars were filled with, was covered with smoke, and you couldn't see out.
We seen a big ball of fire, and the train was like jumping, and people were being thrown everywhere, and it was horrible. It was like the world was ending.
Once we stopped, I tried to lift myself up, but my injured shoulder wouldn't let me. The lady sitting next to me started walking on me, and I thought, well, okay, I survived the impact, now I'm going to be trampled to death.
Passengers were buried in the debris, but there was an eerie calm. There was no panic. The main concern at that point was simply getting off the train.
I have 5 medic units and 3 helicopters at this time.
We're using National Guard, we're using state police helicopters and ambulances. The best thing we can say now is that we do have multiple deaths.
The final death toll was 16, including the Amtrak engineer. More than 170 others were injured, many of them trapped in the wreckage until rescue workers could reach them. It was a non-stop effort. The accident site was a scene of confusion, carnage, destruction. When the wreckage was cleared away and the facts began to emerge, the engineer of the Conrail locomotive faced serious criminal charges. His name is Ricky Gates, and he agreed to talk with 2020 and only with us about that day.
What do you remember seeing as far as the wreckage, the people, the injured, and those coming out of the homes around here to help?
Yeah, that was it. There was people pouring out of their houses. I was looking at the wreckage immediately. My thoughts was just assisting passengers and whoever I could. Many of them were, they were walking off the train. They seemed dazed or in shock. There were many more injured that were stuck in the trains. They weren't as quite as visible because they were still inside.
What was going through your mind at that point?
I was just overwhelmed with how big and how bad it was, and the amount of injuries and the whole situation, you know.
Come on, everybody, move over to the side.
The situation that night was especially painful for the relatives of those aboard the Colonial. Many of them spent hours in the agony of uncertainty.
I called all the hospitals and asked them if she was there, and she wasn't. And I kept calling back to the...
Susan and Roger Horn's daughter, Cerise, was on her way back to Princeton University to start her second semester. A brilliant student, she was a college freshman at the age of just 16.
I heard on the news that there had been a crash and then called the young lady who had taken her to the station.
Arthur and Ann Johnson were worried about their 20-year-old daughter. Christy Johnson was on her way to New York to see her sister. An avid horsewoman, she was finishing her junior break at Stanford. She was considering a career in medicine. The parents' vigil lasted all night and part of the next day.
It was about 2 in the afternoon when we finally got the word.
Christy, C-H-R-I-S-T-I-E, Johnson, J-O-H-N-S-O-N, 20 years old.
The Johnsons' wait was over. So was the Horns. Both girls were dead.
I just said, how could that be taken away? God wants those kind of people on this earth to make the earth a better place. But it didn't turn out that.
The parents' grief would turn to anger as the facts began to emerge about what actually happened at this switch on that Sunday afternoon. Fact number 1, Ricky Gates ignored a warning signal, failing to slow down, and then went through a stop signal before his locomotives skidded into the path of the passenger train.
This one was a stop signal that the others would have told me to reduce to 30 miles per hour, prepared to stop at this signal.
What speed were you going when you passed this point?
At that point, I was still going 60.
Gates lied to investigators at first, saying the signals gave him a go-ahead.
Fact number 2, the warning whistle on Gates' locomotive did not work. It had been tampered with, blocked with adhesive tape, apparently by a previous crew. Had the whistle worked, it would have sounded automatically as Gates' locomotive sped through the caution signal.
The biggest single, I guess, technical problem would have been the whistle being taped over.
The alert whistle taped over.
Right.
It was Gates' job to correct the whistle problem before he left the yard. He did not.
That particular day, I was looking to cut corners. I didn't know where the whistle was located in that particular engine.
I keep hearing you say cutting corners, cutting corners. Now, why? What was your rush?
Just to get the job over with. I wanted to get the job done and be home that evening in my favorite bar, really.
Fact number 3, Gates and his brakeman were both smoking marijuana aboard their locomotive just before the collision.
After we left the yard, when we were on Amtrak's main line heading up to this point, I took about 3 hits off. We were passing it back and forth.
Were you a regular smoker of marijuana, something you'd used before?
Yes, I had used it before. I suppose I would call myself a regular user.
In terms of missing the warning lights, missing the pre-alerts, do you think the marijuana had any effect on you?
No. Only to the point where it was a distraction to me on the engine, that we were passing it back and forth and conversing.
At what point did you realize you had slid through the signal, you were on the tracks, and you were going to be hit by a speeding train?
I didn't realize it at all until impact itself.
Were you braced for it? Did you have any idea it was coming?
I wasn't braced for it. I had no idea it was coming. Yes, it was an incredible impact. Gosh.
This was not an accident. This was a violent crime. This was people who deliberately chose to smoke marijuana on the job, take that train out, just fooling around and speeding the train and pleasuring themselves instead of watching the signals. That wasn't an accident. You know, that was people who were deliberately doing foolish things. And it wasn't an accident that people like that were allowed to operate that equipment.
Has your mind come back here in the months that have ensued and you've thought about what happened here? How's it impacted on you?
Well, I was still am at times very depressed about it.
So depressed, Gates said, that he even contemplated suicide.
Yes, many times right after the accident.
By coming back here?
Yes, at one point, yes, I was one of my options for committing suicide was dressing up in my same clothes and being ready for work and coming out here on the same day and waiting for the same train. You know, the only thing that really stopped me from carrying it out, I believe, was just remembering that I would probably know the engineer and make him feel as miserable as I do.
I feel very sorry for him. I think that he is now going to have to live the rest of his life knowing what he caused and the enormous tragedy and the enormous sadness that he has brought to so many lives across this country.
It's a lot more important to find the next 10 Ricky Gateses out there and stop them now than it is to do something about the last one. He had a dozen speeding convictions, including an arrest for drunken driving 2 or 3 weeks before the crash. He had had his license suspended twice. He was a chronic alcoholic.
The most frequent place for years was just ahead of us here on the right up here, a place called Stanley's.
Ricky Gates is an admitted alcoholic and drug user. He sought treatment after the accident. As he showed us some of his old haunts, he said that while drugs are a new problem on the railroads, drinking on the job is more accepted.
We get the train out of the yard first and get things going, and then we decide where we were going to stop and get beer along the way.
So you'd be running down the tracks and drinking a cool beer? Huh?
Sure, yeah.
From your perspective now, did you ever drive drunk on trains, do you think?
Yeah, at least a few times I can remember.
Other than alcohol abuse, what other drugs were you aware of that were used by the railroad men?
Well, like I said, mostly marijuana use was something I partaked in. Amphetamines, I knew about them. Cocaine use.
That's sort of frightening to think of running a high-speed, powerful locomotive on speed, on marijuana, on alcohol. What were you guys thinking of?
I know for myself, I actually used to tell myself that on marijuana, at least anyway, that I could actually run the train better. You know, that's the way I felt, that my perceptions were enhanced and that I was actually doing a better job.
Ricky Gates says that only a rigorous system of random, unannounced testing would have detected his drug use. Right now, the only railroad drug testing required by federal regulations takes place in the wake of an accident or when a supervisor has reasonable cause to suspect impairment. And even those regulations are under attack in the courts. The regulations are written by this man, Federal Railroad Administrator John Riley. He believes they don't go far enough, that random testing for drugs should be mandatory.
I absolutely do. And maybe the bottom line to it all, Tom, is that you've talked to Ricky Gates. Gates made the point, which we've always known, that you can beat a reasonable cause testing program by procedures as simple as taking the drugs with you into the locomotive cab. They consume the drugs in the cab. And God knows you don't want to have a rule that forces people to consume drugs in the workplace. It was about 16 months ago that I stood on top of a crumpled piece of metal out on a freezing night at Chase, Maryland, and watched people die. I watched 2 people die right in front of my own eyes. They were innocent.
I feel that the gifts that they were prevented from giving, somehow parents and friends have got to turn around to change the system so that some legislation can come in now to prevent just that.
The Johnsons and the Horns and their supporters have become lobbyists for that legislation. They want more than the current regulations. They want the Congress to pass laws to require comprehensive drug testing on the railroads. Bills have been introduced, but they're strongly opposed by the railroad unions and have not gotten out of committee.
I believe that clearly it will pass once it gets to the House floor. We've just got to get it there.
Yes.
As for Ricky Gates, he was sentenced to 5 years in prison. He pleaded guilty to manslaughter by locomotive and then to obstructing the investigation. As part of his plea bargain, he was forced to confess the details of his negligence, to put them on the public record. He said he hoped that knowledge of the tragedy might help change the system, might save lives, and give meaning to those lost.
Cerise, with her love of people, if her death can bring about this change, then maybe her life will have brought much better conditions to many other people on this earth. And maybe that was the purpose of God's giving her all the gifts that she had in this world.
Yes, I hope. Tom, how would random